Okay, good afternoon, good morning everyone. I am going to be talking about building science and in particular the way that it relates to learning spaces and cognitive development on children especially. It's quite an interesting topic for me, and I'll introduce my background. Firstly, anyone that's needing Green Star CPD points, you can register. So just follow these instructions and get in contact with us, and then you'll be able to get your CPD points that way. So that's fantastic. So my journey in terms of this topic is I have a background in education and working in various architectural practices, and now working with SUHO in sustainable design, which is my lifelong passion. I am also a mother and have worked in schools through placements and have learnt a few things about the way that children need to develop in the spaces that they need to be in. And I came across an article that I found quite interesting, and it was from The Economist. There's a little image of it down there, but it's called "Of the Rise of Buildings for the Deaf and Blind." And what it made me think about is how in architecture and building design, typically a lot of buildings don't actually account for people that have sensory issues. And working in schools, I very much saw that there were a lot of environmental impacts that were causing distress in children and their development, and making them feel excluded. So it's very important to have this crossover between these two disciplines, these two topics, and finding some common ground that is really beneficial for students and development. One thing that I didn't know until doing my studies is that quite often sensory impairments are coupled with other sensory impairments. So for instance, in Indigenous communities, which I looked at a lot in my studies, Indigenous communities, there is a genetic deposition to having, say, hearing loss at an early age is quite common, but also there are very, very common rates of eye infections and things like that, which can lead to eye disease and so forth, and then later in life, glaucoma. So it's very important to look after the total of the population by having more inclusive environments and more inclusive learning spaces in particular, which is what this presentation is about. I've also got a very good knowledge base on visual communications in architecture, and I try to, from my background in visual communications, try to push the envelope in terms of how to actually bring people through the spaces. So if people aren't able to hear or listen for instructions, then trying to pull someone through the space by having a certain level of visual contrast or repetition or something like that, something really interesting to bring them through the space. Obviously isolation and home life has impacted people quite a lot as well. I know for the parents that are out there that are having to do a lot of homeschooling, they are finding that children aren't reacting to the spaces that they're in maybe as well as what they thought, and a lot of that relates to how the brains develop. So there's a lot of undiagnosed conditions, a lot of behaviours that don't need a label. We don't need to go and label everything, but it could actually be environmental issues, and the fact that these children in particular can't actually express the difficulties that they're having. So one of the things that we can look at as designers in improving these spaces, providing more fresh air so there's less CO2 and there's better concentration. The environments are more inclusive, so they can be adaptable, they can work thermally very, very well, they're very stable, and you know, children aren't feeling like they're all huddled together, and there's less health issues if we have these healthy spaces. When I was first putting this webinar together, something quite interesting popped up in my mailbox, and that was actually from my childcare provider, saying that because of the COVID-19 situation, the children were required to do some sleeping outside because of the fresh air issues. So, you know, it really emphasised this point that I'm trying to push in a lot of buildings that I'm doing, is that we really need to be using sustainable design and all of these sort of building science principles to push buildings to the next level. It doesn't necessarily have to include a heap of extra costs. It's just about making this a better accessible, healthy building for everyone, rather than having compounding effects of illness and transfer of disease and so forth. So in short, a lot of my studies focused in education on middle schooling, but then this book that I was actually introduced to as part of my fundamental core studies within education is fantastic, and I actually prefer this one over any of the parenting books. This has everything that I need, and basically what it tells you is the way that the brain is actually developing. So it's not necessarily about behaviour, but parts of the brain that are actually being switched on at certain points. And something that I didn't realise before having kids and doing this study, I kind of took for granted all of these abilities that we have, and the ability to think abstractly and so forth, especially as a creative myself. But those parts of the brains aren't actually switched on until certain points in development. So it's really interesting to actually find this overlap and work out how we can make environments that children can be included in, they can adapt and manipulate and feel more engaged in the space, and therefore their learning is much more enriched. So quite often in children's development there's things like difficulty speaking, which can be to do with acoustics or not enough insulation, so reverberation through spaces. Quite often in the early stages of development, they're also, especially really, really young, so maybe up to the age of 1.5, they're actually using their mouth as a tool for gaining information. And as they develop, they start to understand how they're not necessarily connected to their parent. They have a different idea of self, and so you have to have spaces that actually essentially give them an opportunity to create that identity and push the envelope and push their learning and create symbols out of something that they construct which represents something to them, and it's really broadening their horizons. So in this book, without going into all of the detail, I've essentially summarised the theory that I connected to the most, and the relationship that it does have with building sciences. So in terms of a building designer or an ESD consultant or so forth, you really need to understand, if you're designing spaces for particular age groups, how you actually have to enrich that learning space through sustainable design, thermal comfort, better acoustics, making it adaptable and so forth. So up until the age of 2, as I said, a lot of children learn through their mouth or by mouthing and gain information by that. They might find that something is squishy and so forth. They learn about taste as well. So the learning using the 5 senses plus their motor skills are developing. So by quiet spaces that are focused for learning, say as mats that can dampen noise, and so they can actually concentrate on those areas, that can be really good for learning as well. So constant temperature and fresh air and limiting areas for germs. Areas that can be easily wiped down don't necessarily also provide the level of acoustics that we need. So you need things that can adapt and pull out a rug, give it a wash, bring it back in, all those sorts of things. The pre-operational period is actually really interesting, and I have 2 children in this category. And speaking to the second point, I can emphasise that the most, but essentially what they're trying to do is represent the world through different symbols and use their creativity to create something that represents something else. In this stage, they're really testing out their bodies and pushing the boundaries and learning about mobility and balance and connection with other people and cause and effect. So you really need areas that are quite durable. In terms of building design and sustainability, we can use a lot of very great thermally performant dense materials for thermal mass that can actually really control and regulate the temperature inside of these places. And having a really insulated envelope means that the acoustics in that space is also very subdued and natural, which is fantastic for learning. So they can be creative in these spaces. You need to have areas where they can construct things. So one of my son's favourite things to do is get the milk crates and stack them and, you know, represent this is a home and I'm going to pretend to be a family, or this is the doctor and I'm the doctor and you're the patient, and those sorts of things. So they really need ability to be fluid within spaces, which also means as a designer, and it's less important about creating these pods within a space, but creating an envelope that is not only airtight and acoustically performing well, but it's also engaging in terms of materials and lighting as well. In the concrete operations period, up to 11 years old or thereabouts, they need the flexibility in learning. So generally they're less focused on the immediate areas, and they need that line of sight. Their concentration only lasts for about 3 minutes, so they need this consistent change or switch up to keep them engaged. So in terms of teaching pedagogies, what we do is we actually give an instruction at the start of the class from the front of the class, and then we'll actually move all focus to a little table where we might do a one-on-one experiment with all of the students and things like that. That's really emphasising that we are switching up lines of sight, materials and directions, and having a space which is very controlled in terms of light and very, very balanced and beautiful can actually aid in that learning. Air is a huge one. So in a lot of the buildings that I were in, I've worked in some really poorly insulated buildings and some better insulated buildings that didn't have the same sort of ambience that you need. It's very important to actually have enough volume in these spaces to get the air working, but also have a lot of fresh air without letting too much noise in. The only way that we can do this as designers is by having a better insulated envelope and allowing that air to come in by other means. So by mixing fresh air into the space, using something like a HRV system, then that is a really good way of regulating and recovering heat that we're using in the space as well, which means the performance of the building is a lot better. I'm sure all schools want costs to reduce as well. Lighting is a huge one. I worked in a lot of classrooms where there was such poor lighting that the students couldn't pick up on contrast and things like that would make it more engaging. Or it'd be too bright that they actually couldn't concentrate and they were squinting. So it's very important to use things like the eaves overhang, external shading and things like that in summer to not only control the temperature in the building, but the lighting. So diffuse the lighting, have high level windows instead of windows that are adjacent where they're working, and that's a much better introduction of light and balanced light that we can control. By doing that as well, if we're using things like the ceiling, we can actually possibly reduce the amount of artificial lighting that we're actually needing in the spaces. Less buzzing from lights. That was an annoying thing in some classrooms. And we can actually reduce the consumption on the building. In the formal operations period, students are really trying to identify where they fit in the world. So they are starting to reason and constructing their little worlds and their little clique groups that gives them a sense of identity. And what I think is the most important in terms of developing students' brains at this stage is giving them ability to have identity within a larger classroom. I was working in a classroom where there was a student that very visibly had some sensory and learning issues, and there wasn't enough ability for us to adapt the space. There was very, very little external daylighting provided to the classroom. And so we couldn't actually adjust that space to give them a sense of inclusiveness. And what that poorly performing space did was actually make that student feel even more occluded. It almost centralised them within all of this other chatter from the other students, and they couldn't actually get away from it. So it's very important to actually create that sense of break but proximity to other people if children actually need it. In terms of inclusive environments, you can also have a look at the fact that a lot of people have a different thermal comfort zone. So from the belly to just above the head might be different for an adult than it is a child. Children are always down on the ground or doing different things that are at different levels. And without having a thermally performant building, you can't regulate those temperatures as well. People that have disability or something, or they don't have use of their legs and so they can't reach windows with their arms, can create quite a bit of issue in terms of inclusive environments, which is where we start introducing things like automation, where people can actually operate buildings by their phones, or automatic sensors and things like that, which actually adapt the building and is actually immersive learning for people. Immersive learning for children is fantastic, because then they're actually trying to figure out why one thing happened to cause this other thing. So if the blinds come down on the outside and it's a really hot day or something, then it could be that the building is actually adapting to the needs of that space to give it a solid sort of thermal comfort region. The other fantastic thing that it does is allows the humidity inside of the building and things from so many students and sweating. They come back in off lunch break and they're all hyped up and hot because they've been racing around playing basketball. You need systems in there that actually regulate that humidity and provide better fresh air to those spaces to actually help the performance of the space work a bit better. Also to dry out materials like plasterboard, if the plasterboard is getting too much moisture in it or something like that, because the classroom is essentially a little oven, then we need to rethink the way that we're doing the envelopes in these buildings. I do think that it is an actual fundamental right that we should be giving a lot of students, a lot of people through society, that we're not giving at the moment, because the buildings aren't inclusive. They aren't able to be adapted, people can't learn from them, and quite often we use band-aid remedies. So for the building sciences, I think we're in a really good position to make that change. The things that we can look at, the very typical things are temperature, acoustics and air, but we can also think outside of the box and provide sensory enrichment through smell or controlling smell as well, so say the science room or art room, and humidity. So it's very important to think outside of the box and think about all of those senses. So in terms of inclusive environments, any designer that thinks a student sits still on rows and rows of desks has got to be kidding themselves. So part of what teachers do, as I said, is they switch up their teaching pedagogy, so it's not all directed in the one place, or they might take them outside and do an activity. Get them down on the ground and shuffling papers around on a larger scale. So you're more likely to get this sort of activity, people jumping on tables, than in an uncontrolled space than you are in a very enriched educational space. Playing with different vocal planes kind of ties back to the visual communications interest that I have also, where we're actually trying to create a sense of journey through a space by what we're doing with materials, temperature of the materials and so forth, or even acoustics. So if you can imagine, like in this image, that there's someone that doesn't have sight, you can actually bring them through a space by using things like rhythm and repetition in materials or surfaces or textures to actually bring them through a space. What you can also do is look at things like lighting. So if you've got very dispersed and even lighting, you could slightly switch that up and indicate the end of a space is actually really, really bright lighting, so that they don't necessarily want to hang out there. So it's a really good way to change up education as we know it, and we're getting some really good examples out there. So we can shift materials and colours. We don't necessarily want to focus on colours as in paint, unless it's something like a low VOC paint. But we can use colours of materials and make the subtle changes so that there's not too much contrast. In terms of sensory overload, quite often children also have issues if there's too much contrast. So as visual communicators or as designers of spaces, we've got to make sure that we're not making things too contrasty, otherwise it's too much information in one go. So that's where natural materials actually work really, really beautifully for that. Slight temperature changes between spaces, daylighting, sound, proximity. So you can see the example on the left there, there's a group of students working together on the ground. It gives a different scale to the way that they're learning. You can have instruction from up at the front of the class, or the teacher could walk around the classroom. So you've really got to get your mindset out of the fact that teachers stand at the front of the class and they just dictate, because that doesn't happen these days. The space on the right is a really cool space for learning, where you can see that the children are actually connecting to nature. I'm not sure if that is artificial turf, but in any case the children probably won't care, because it's really connecting with the outside, really diffused lighting, really balanced. I would imagine the thermal comfort in that space is quite nice, as long as the humidity is also regulated, but it just gives them that very different line of sight. So the role that we play as designers is looking at the thermal comfort, the materials, touch, sound and acoustics, and dampening and daylighting control. But it's also very good for multilingual children. So quite often multilingual children, because they're learning two or more languages, or different versions of languages, they need these acoustic controlled spaces to actually help their learning. Especially if they've got hearing problems that are undiagnosed. So it's important to have that communication about their learning needs. Thermally stable and better acoustics also means airtight and fresh air, and I'll elaborate on this in just a second also. But we're really trying to emphasise, or I'm really trying to emphasise through this webinar, that you really need to look at the senses, and especially if people have dual sensory impairment, say hearing and sight or something like that, very important to make spaces that can be adapted through other means. So the disruption is essentially them not knowing how to change environments. I've heard lots and lots of stories during this isolation period that we're all in. I'm not saying I'm an expert. I'm giving you what I've read and I've learnt, but a lot of those sensory disruptions are caused by children actually not being able to express themselves. So that goes back to the 4 stages of development that I described at the beginning of this. So those different operational stages, as their brain is actually turning on, allows them to finally express through words, because they can abstractly think of how to describe it, what the issue is. So a lot of young children are finding that they can't concentrate in certain spaces. Again, with the proximity thing, a lot of children are finding that they're removed from their parents a little bit too much, but we can actually introduce things like sentimental smells and things like that that can actually enhance those learning spaces. Being able to hear a little bit if, say, an adult or the parent is working in a different room to the child can actually still hear some of the activities, and it's not such a closed off environment and isolating. I would imagine for a lot of kids at the moment that this isolation is also like very socially isolating, because they're not physically able to connect with a lot of their peers. You see a lot of children in schools and they're actually shoulder to shoulder almost sometimes, because they still need that comfort and touch that they get from their parents, and they don't necessarily get it if they're removed completely. So it's very confronting for a lot of kids. Designers also are very commonly not placing windows, as I said, where people maybe in a wheelchair or so forth can't actually reach them. So we need to push this this concept that the building can actually be operated more remotely than what we're traditionally used to. So too much light or sound can cause this sensory overload. Too much humidity, as we know. You can imagine standing in an elevator with 15 people, how humid and how much CO2 would be in that space. and not allowing enough height within buildings to actually allow that natural sort of convection to happen. I have worked in a private school where a ceiling was actually quite low, probably would have been about 2.4 metres high. And although the building was fairly well designed, there just wasn't enough, well, first of all, there wasn't any natural daylighting into that room, but there wasn't enough height in that room to actually allow that convection to happen. And then on the opposite scale, I've worked in a school where there was a lot of height, but the building was so thermally poor that there was too much airflow happening, and the building was so leaky that it made it a very, very cold environment for the children to be working in. And they don't want to be huddled together like penguins. You know, they want to be expressive and move around and enjoy their space. So we need to firstly look at how we can make spaces better for ambulant people, and make accessibility at different heights. So don't treat acoustics with band-aid remedies, so don't just maybe put sound check on or something like that. Look at planes, materials. One great example would be if you've got a line of windows, you can look at a space in front of those windows where you can specifically use exposed thermal mass and create a sense of warmth and connection to that spot, so it's a better learning space. And then outside of that, in the general classroom area, might be a different material. That'd be a great way to switch it up and also adopt some strategies that a lot of teachers are using in their pedagogies. Introducing fresh air is a must. So not only does it help the concentration, but it also helps the long-term health of the construction and make the space adaptable to size and use. So especially in my children's instance, where they're between 3 and 7, I think that scale was, they're needing that durability and be able to create their own space and little cubby houses and represent something in symbols through manipulation of space. So we've got to allow that durability. So I've touched on this previously, so I won't go into it too much further, but they can feel isolated within the classroom if it's not planned correctly, or if it's just rows of seats, or even at home, depending on how those senses are different between the different spaces. So for instance, if your children are homeschooled in a space that's a little bit cooler than the space that you're currently working in, and they're walking to meet you and things, and they're actually seeing that shift in temperature, that can also affect their concentration, their sense of connection. So again, having a holistic view of the building and the performance, and this envelope technology can actually aid in that connection and that sense of proximity, even if they are a little bit further away. Having sound damp and checkpoints are a really good example as well. So in the instance, maybe again where we've got this thermal mass on the floor that students can really concentrate on learning in front of a window, you might also above that on the ceiling have some sort of dampening noise, because you are expecting that space is going to be a little bit more noisy, or it could be that the noise is a bit higher outside of those spaces, and so therefore you need to treat that differently. So again, using different planes and different focal lengths to actually break up that visual line of sight, but also create little acoustic pockets of learning within spaces. So for anyone in building science, this actually might look familiar, but this is actually an acoustic diagram. So when we're looking at air tightness and envelope technology, quite often what we do is we give a red pen test, which actually shows the outline of where this control layer is. I actually found this one, and it's actually to do with acoustics, so they're very highly relatable, these two concepts. And in this instance, which I believe is a fairly world-renowned example for acoustics, is talking about the airspeed and displacement cooling and things to actually allow that control of acoustics. We do very similar things in terms of thermal control. So this example here is from the 10-star home, where we have thermally controlled, but also that helps with the acoustics from the street, thermally controlled this envelope to provide much better overall envelope performance on the building. And then we communicate that through very detailed diagrams that again adopt that red line to show where this control layer is. So if you're thinking about a classroom, or say this is an auditorium, this example on the left there, then you're actually controlling that whole space, even if you've got some dampeners and so forth that are hanging below that. So we're actually having that overall look at spaces and introducing fresh air into those areas to make them much more comfortable. Because the other thing with air tightness is if it's too tight and there's not the fresh air, then it can be very uncomfortable to be in. So in terms of brain development, have a look at this book if you are interested. Even though it doesn't specifically talk about design, it talks about things that designers are always trying to mimic in their buildings that they're designing. So they're always trying to look at the way that people are going to behave in spaces, and without understanding brain development, it's very difficult to execute that plan very well. So there is this misconception that these environments that involve parents and children, that children can actually just be removed, and although they've been given a beautiful space, they might have plants around or so forth, or access to everything they want, what they are lacking and what they do actually want is this sense of connection still, and this sense of safety that they get from, say, their parents. So by using the performance of the building and the acoustics between those two spaces, it's a very good way of keeping that engagement and that sense of them creating their identity through being in a different room, but they still have that security of their parents, which they need up until maybe teenage years. So as I've said there, so the physiological and scientific studies supporting proximity as a fundamental of feeling safe and connected, that kind of explains it. So they need this sense of separation to create an identity, but what they don't need is complete removal. So we need to still make those connections. And in terms of connection, I know in the architecture circles when we're all trained, we're taught about this notion of the hearth and how the hearth is changing, that the hearth typically would have been something like a fireplace or something warm, something connecting to family. But as we start to lead more tech-heavy lives and have that sense of removal for certain things, we need to look at the overall comfort of a building rather than just little spaces within that building. Really look at bundling technical areas together and having conditioned areas strategically where it's going to have the best thermal performance. So we can use repetition, and in the instance of people that don't have vision, Braille is a good one. You can actually put it on surfaces in the example that I'm about to show you. Using temperature to bring people through spaces. So if you're transitioning from a very, very slightly cool place into a slightly warmer place, that might indicate for someone that doesn't have sight that, there's a classroom on the right or something like that. But it's about balancing that and not deviating too much, because otherwise that can actually kind of fracture the senses and disrupt that journey that someone is going through. So this is a really good example of a particular school that I found when I was doing my studies that is super, super interesting. There are actually a couple of architects out there in the world that are actually quite well known that have gone through life for the majority with all five senses, but that have in some regard lost part of their senses, and that's made them a better designer. Alan Dunlop actually designed this school for the blind, and it specifically focuses on this notion of using materials to bring people through the spaces. There's fine little nuances on the material that students can pick up and use their hands, their touch, so another sense, to actually give them the safe journey through that building without having that disruption. And the planning is really cool too. So they are near another site which is very, very high noise, so they automatically needed an approach where the envelope was insulated, and so that protected also from the acoustics, so naturally it was got to be a bit more airtight. And looking at the different ways of using air within the space to actually create that balance for the students. Sound in terms of the tap on certain surfaces also gave from what I was reading, gave a sense of journey through that space as well. So you can imagine the tap on that concrete is a bit different than maybe on a classroom where it shifts very gradually to carpet or something. There's also, in terms of the design approach, there's also repetitions in the way that the classrooms are planned out, and you can see just from this plan here, which is better shown on here, these spaces are fairly typical. They're kind of like pods that are replicated on this space. So instead of having sudden stops in the journey, there's subtle movements, and this beautiful spline that goes through the middle of this space helps to create that journey by having some typical pods that are attached to the side, and then using that materiality to really bring someone through the space. Something that this building also adopts a lot of is diffused lighting, so not having really hot patches of, say, warmed up concrete next to cooler spaces, and so it really makes the indoor comfort of the area really uncomfortable. Looking at lighting through high level lighting, dispersing it so that there's less lighting, but then task lighting over certain areas. Some of these children still had some level of sight, and so they need balanced lighting instead of harsh lighting. So that was really interesting. So I guess in summary, what I'm trying to push in terms of the knowledge behind this, and I'm open to questions as well, is about using the thermal performance and these building science principles to actually increase the engagement in these spaces. They can make them a lot more inclusive. The scales in particular, in terms of how teachers work and the pedagogies that we use, different learning scales for different places within a classroom is fantastic, because it creates that sense of identity that students, especially in their teenage years, are trying to create. Gives them a sense of ownership. Envelope, so in a lot of these instances where there's sensory issues, having sudden stops can be really, really disruptive. And sudden stops, as I said earlier, could also be something to do with lighting. Having a sudden stop in lighting or having too much contrast, that can also create issues. Safety and movement, so using width a little bit more, so through doorways and so forth. So let's work on spaces that can actually be adapted for, say, a different occupant down the track that might be ambulant, whereas the original occupant might not have been. Quite often schools, classrooms change around, and you need that level of adaptability to increase the lifespan of the building. Culture and society is actually built through the connection to spaces. So by having a connection, for instance, within a classroom or a home that is supported by the building sciences, it makes it a much more comfortable space, and people can spend more time in that space connecting. So there's also benefits to the mind as well. There's a whole background to psychology and how people connect to different spaces. There is another architect, I think his name was Paul Downey, but he actually has a TED Talk which I'd really love you to look up as well, and it was great. He was actually talking about how he went blind later in life and connected to spaces in the city, and how the planning of cities also need to change because they are disruptive as people come out of learning spaces into society. So overall, as designers, we need to change. We need to really push those boundaries and make sure that we're including as many people as we can. And it makes the buildings and the spaces last a lot longer in terms of their lifespan. So I hope that wasn't too much information for you. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. But please, if you need CPD points, register through these steps and contact us. We also have Sam on the line just in case there are any questions, and contact us if you need any more information. SUHO does have a lot of other webinars that are running through YouTube as well, so please take notice of those and watch the reruns if you like, or get in contact with us. So you can contact us at info@suho.com.au. and we have various services in ESD, design, compliance, town planning and so forth. So please get in touch. I'll just see if there's any questions on the chat. Right, looks like we're all good. Okay, thank you. And as I said, if you have any questions, if anyone's that's watching this later, then please contact us, and it'll be great to keep in touch. Thanks.